So I brought up a nice definition, and it says research is something that people undertake in order to find out things in systematic way, thereby increasing their knowledge.
It's false. No way. It's fiction. It's a total fabrication. It's an urban legend that never happened.
You know what grills my cheese? So this video floated into my feed apparently claiming that Godzilla doesn't work in America. That seemed like a rather strange claim to make considering how successful most Godzilla movies have been in America, so I decided to check out what exactly Doktor Skipper was talking about here, and what I found was a painful 26 minutes of over-edited nonsense that fails to get a single good point across due to how terribly put together it is. Yeah, no long intro this time, there's a lot to talk about here, and I want to get into it as soon as possible. Welcome to the final installment of Blotswave's terrible Godzilla YouTube content anime trilogy. And we're about to close on a high note, for better or for worse. This video tries to make an argument that Godzilla as a whole just can't work in America for a number of reasons, but all the reasons given are painfully terrible and sometimes even just outright wrong, showing that no research was put into this whatsoever, and it boils down to just an angry rambling with no basis in fact. Let's just get right into it. So the video starts with this.
I can swallow up, bottle up, I'll pull up, feel like Godzilla.
Get out the way, Eminem! This is my video!
It's worth noting that a lot of this video is just unrelated nonsense like this, so in interest of my, as well as your time, I'm going to skip over these unrelated bits and only talk about the actual points Dr. Skipper tries to make in his video. I'll make counterpoints to what he says that may either be quick or more lengthy, depending on the severity, complexity, yada yada, of what he says that I think needs to be argued, or at least explain as to why it's wrong. So after his opening, he gives us this little tidbit of information.
Godzilla is so popular that a lot of people didn't even know that it originated in Japan.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure mostly everyone who's ever heard of Godzilla ever knows he's from Japan. Like, I think we can all agree that Godzilla and Attack Japan go hand in hand. Even the most basic jokes about Godzilla you'll come across in media are ones based around the fact he mostly attacks the Japanese.
Or that it's in the public domain in the United States, since Toho, the company that created Godzilla, never expected the freak lizard to get marvelized one day. So they didn't renew and manipulate the copyright system like a certain company.
Whoa, slow down. What the fuck? Did you just say Godzilla is in the public domain here in the United States? I'm not sure as to what legality with the Godzilla copyright you just referred to, but I can 100% confirm to you that Godzilla is not in the public domain here in the United States. Are you aware that Legendary Pictures had to pay Toho millions of dollars in order to use their Godzilla characters for their films? Also, you know how everyone can upload Steamboat Willie to YouTube now because it's entered the public domain? Good luck doing that with Godzilla. Speaking from experience, Toho will wipe your video from existence if it even has a mere 5 seconds of unedited Godzilla footage or music in it. Do you not think Godzilla's copyright held by Toho is effective overseas? Are you trying to get people to get themselves into major copyright infringement lawsuits? And a lot of what you will say and have said already has nothing to do with Godzilla either. For all those who want to say, Blotswave, you're skipping around the video and not following its narrative, so of course it doesn't make sense to you? No. I watched the whole video and I'm only discussing the important bits. I'm only ignoring the unrelated things like this because they're, well, unrelated.
But then in 2014, when I was 12 playing, I don't know, GTA 5?
Oh, my N-word, huh?
The first Americanized version of Godzilla came out. Thus, I went down in a really big Godzilla rabbit hole, and it gave me a big appreciation for the creature, its impact on filmmaking, and made me reevaluate how I look at the Godzilla brand as a whole.
Oh, well, that sounds nice. Maybe this won't go so bad, and...
Also, there's a big thing I need to address in this video. I kinda hate Godzilla, if we're gonna be honest.
Fucking never mind. Bud is making a whole video essay on a topic he just admitted to hating. Oh boy. I wonder if this video will just evolve into being one giant hateful rant that exists just to be hateful and has no ground to stand on because of this.
To make this really easy for you to understand, Godzilla has what I like to call the Jurassic Park effect.
So to summarize, he says the first Jurassic Park film is really the only one with meaning. Which, yeah, I can agree with that. Where are you going with this?
But Jurassic Park, yeah, the IP is now just CGI wars with Chris Pratt. I don't know what the hell a carbine rifle is gonna do to dinosaurs. I mean, Mark Wahlberg used a gun to fight metal aliens. I give up.
Guy, he used an alien gun specifically designed to harm aliens. What do you... Okay, that's unrelated. Just finish your point.
And while still making a lot of money, because they sure as hell did that, they have like no cultural impact at all. This is what happened with Godzilla.
What? Guy, what are you talking about? No cultural impact. You're telling me Godzilla had no cultural impact, huh? Never mind the fact these films helped make Godzilla a staple of Japanese icons, and helped launch this kaiju genre in Japan that's received worldwide fame. Nope, no cultural impact whatsoever. What kind of cultural impact are you talking about anyway? I vividly remember most of these films being everywhere back when they were going to be released. It's all a lot of us could talk about. Sure, they didn't end up being so great, but a lot of us were certainly going crazy about each one. We were all fascinated with the idea of returning to this world to see these iconic creatures, and hoping we'd somehow end up getting a good one. Unless by cultural impact you mean it didn't cause us to sit back and go, wow, that's some deep shit. Which is a fair assessment, except you never go into if this is what you meant.
I don't have any nostalgia for the old Godzilla movies. Yeah, I still watched them a bit when I was a kid.
The fuck?
And even rewatched them recently when I got the idea for this video. So no bias. 98% of them suck ass.
Yeah, that no bias isn't going to fly. You've stated that you hate the Godzilla franchise twice now. The second time even claiming you hate 98% of it. And based on several statements you've made so far which display lack of research, are you sure this video isn't just going to be a biased, hateful rant towards something you've already admitted to hating twice now?
Godzilla fell into the same trap that all successful franchises eventually fall into.
My brother in crime. No, he fucking didn't. Let's look at the examples you just compared the Godzilla franchise to. First was Kenobi, a show with writing so insultingly low effort and nonsensical because Disney figured they didn't need to try with it. Just dangle some keys for prequel fans with Ewan McGregor and Hayden Christensen and hope that nobody notices how terrible the show is. Next is Thor Love and Blunder from the Marvel Cinematic Ass Infection, a film broken beyond reason that was essentially a director not trying to make a proper adaptation of the source material, but rather just sucking himself off for the praise he got of the last film that he made for this series, which also wasn't good. Fuck you, Taika. Just fuck you. Next is Indiana Jones and the Diarrhea of Destiny, a film which also barely tried anything, embarrassed its title character, ruined the arguably best part of the previous film in the series, and existed just so Disney could dangle some other famous Lucasfilm IP keys in order to try to get people to give them more money. After that we see Jurassic Grasshopper, Dominion, a film where the writers made grasshoppers the main thread of a finale for a franchise known for dinosaurs. And finally we see Halo Infinite? That's odd, that game seemed to be received fairly well. Why use this as an example of bad Halo media when you could have used the Jimmy Ring Show? A show apparently based on Halo, a game series that the show's writers proudly admitted to having never played a single entry of before making a show based off of it. And it showed. Anyway, I bring all this up just to say, no. The Godzilla franchise never fell into this trap like you claim it did. Unlike all of the examples that you gave that I just briefly went into, most Godzilla movies, no matter what, have some level of effort, creativity, and genuine amount of trying that went into them. Even All Monsters Attack, a film that relies heavily on just recycling stock footage for previous films, tried to get a positive message across to its audience. A message of standing up for oneself and to try to be brave, as it told a story of a lonely, bullied boy who looked up to Godzilla as his hero, since Godzilla is strong and doesn't take shit from anyone. Practically none of the examples above that you gave are like this. They're all lazy schlop that do the bare minimum required to even be labeled as an alleged film or show that exists so that studios can dangle famous IPs in front of audiences who think they're going to go see something that they like in hopes that they can make a profit off of them.
Godzilla's look was more fascinating to shareholders and executives than the original intentions and creativity that made him even exist in the first place.
Again, that's just simply not true. Godzilla as a franchise always attempts something creative with each entry, whether it be a unique enemy or some kind of messaging behind the film. The franchise never became a shell of itself that only exists to lazily attempt to get money from its audience like you claim it did. Also, I like how you try to make a point of the Godzilla franchise becoming lazy, and corporate executives only caring about his design by using Godzilla Ultima as an example. Like, that Godzilla was imagined as a super deity from another dimension, manifesting as a monster in our world that grows stronger and stronger, until his mere presence in our dimension would have caused our universe to cave in on itself. How is that not creative?
so they spammed out Godzilla films.
They didn't spam them out. A lot of them could be made very quickly, so of course they were released at a rather fast rate. And when the audience kept approving of the films for the most part, they would put out another that would try something new, bringing a new story to the table, because there are plenty of stories to tell with this concept.
He's fighting bugs. He's fighting mechanized versions of himself. He's fighting three-headed dragons. He's doing shit like this.
What ignorant summaries of those films. Like the first one you showed there was from Godzilla, Mothra, and King Ghidorah, Giant Monsters All Out Attack. A film where troubled spirits from the World War possess Godzilla, their rage turning him evil, while guardian spirits of past Japanese warriors that possess other monsters use those monsters to try to defend the country against the deadly evil Godzilla. And you just summarized it as Godzilla fighting a fucking bug. This would be like if I summarized The Dark Knight as a rich guy in a costume fighting a clown for fun.
Because why the hell not?
Because the film studio had different ideas and concepts they wanted to attempt to explore with their creation. Did some have more thought than others? Yeah, certainly. But it never degraded into a random spam of films like you claim it did.
And some of the films are fun, I'll admit it, but for the most part, a lot of the legacy of Godzilla just reeks of cheaply made cash grabs.
No, it doesn't. At worst, it reeks of people claiming the films are just guys in rubber suits fighting. No one ever claims they were cash grabs.
So when Godzilla turned into a cartoon for kids, a lot of adults stopped caring.
In a way, yes, Godzilla did become more child-friendly due to how some of the concepts, such as giant monsters fighting, appeals to children. However, this doesn't mean the franchise stopped trying, or that it's too immature for adults. As I said, All Monsters Attack teaches the audience to stand up for oneself, and Godzilla vs. Hedorah, for example, teaches about the harm of rampant pollution. Those are things I'm pretty sure most of us can get behind no matter our age.
So then the cycle reset, and this time Goji went to America.
What? My brother in Christ, you just skipped over 2 whole ass eras! Eras that returned the franchise to being more mature than it was before. You were complaining about the franchise becoming childish, yet skipped over the 2 eras that went the opposite direction.
Where the same thing happened again. We got a serious Godzilla, and people complained that it was too serious with not enough Godzilla, so the franchise became Looney Tunes.
Who the hell complained that the 2014 film was too serious? I remember complaints of lack of Godzilla, some characters not being interesting enough, and scenes being too dark to see. But who says it was too serious? It didn't become Looney Tunes either. These later films, while less gritty in tone, do take themselves seriously to a degree. They also tried to move to a tone that felt more like modern Showa-era films. Films that could be semi-serious, yet filled with lots of monster spectacle.
And the sequel somehow had worse human characters, and then people got annoyed with Millie Bobby Brown, the fat kid from Deadpool, and Alfred from Atlanta spilling water on a computer to fry Mechagodzilla's motherboard to save the day. And this made some people not really like Godzilla that much anymore.
Yeah, never mind the fact that the franchise has been on a constant high point for the past several years. These films caused a great many people to lose interest in Godzilla, I'm sure. Okay, but seriously, while I get some aren't wildly fond of the MonsterVerse films, due in part to their becoming less gritty in nature, I doubt it caused many of them to not like Godzilla as a whole as he claims.
And now Japan has gone back to reset that cycle, and from ground zero, we got a breath of fresh air again.
Japan never reset a cycle, there was no cycle to be reset. The past few Godzilla projects that have come out of Japan have all been rather serious in tone, keeping Godzilla as a powerful symbol of destruction and fear. Godzilla Minus One just happened to click with audiences the most out of the others for several reasons. Doesn't mean the other projects from Japan didn't try to also have a serious tone. So the next few minutes he spends recapping the history of the filmmakers of the original Gojira film, and their, along with Toho Studios' role, in the Second World War. It basically all serves to explain how the filmmakers saw the horrors of war and used it for inspiration for their film, but it goes on for way too long and again touches on unrelated things. Also, he makes a joke in there about the atomic bombs being dropped on Japan by saying that Oppenheimer took his nuke to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and saying that Oppenheimer turned that bitch into Fallout 3.
He finished the bomb, took it to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and turned that bitch into Fallout 3.
Now I'm someone who can actually take a joke and doesn't have a meltdown over dark humor, but like, when you're trying to get a serious point across about the effects that 2 major Japanese cities being wiped out by nuclear bombs had on its people and their filmmakers, isn't it a bit distasteful to refer to that whole event as a bitch being turned into Fallout 3? Oh, and then following that up by making a joke that the only survivor of it was Wolverine, in reference to an X-Men film.
With the only sole survivor being Wolverine.
Also, you do know there were some survivors, right? Skipper then goes on to recap more history until he eventually arrives at the making of the Godzilla film in response to a nuclear test done by the United States that affected a nearby Japanese boat, claiming that it killed all of the crew?
America started trolling and did a nuclear test on their hydrogen bomb in the Pacific. The bomb was much bigger than the scientists expected, so the radiation caught up to a Japanese boat named the Lucky Dragon No. 5, which killed all the crew via radiation.
Which isn't true. Only one of the crew members, the radio operator, died from the effects of the radioactive exposure. Again, did you do any research? He then goes into how Gojira served as a metaphor for the fear of nuclear power and to raise awareness of it, and how it was inspired in part by the beast of 20,000 fathoms. Which, yeah, that's true so far. It seems he understood some of the basics of the original Godzilla film, or at least some of the ideas behind it, but he's misunderstood all the others up until this point. I hope that doesn't continue.
1954 Gojira is also why I don't like it when Godzilla is an action prop.
Damn it. Okay, so Godzilla is not just an action prop in the other films. There is still plenty of good story and a good amount of the films that give Godzilla some meaning. Like in the Monsterverse, Godzilla, and thusly the other titans, are portrayed as forces of nature, with an underlying message of nature taking its course no matter our efforts to control it. Sure, some films weigh in heavier on this tone than others, but Godzilla's never just, look, big monster punch, wee!
This is why Godzilla 2014 by Gareth Edwards is the best version of Godzilla in the States. But even then, Godzilla doesn't really work in the United States.
So we're 11.5 minutes in, and it seems he's finally going to get to the alleged main point of this video existing. But now he goes off explaining on why he thinks the 2014 Godzilla film is the best American Godzilla film for a number of reasons, such as its visual style. And while I do happen to agree with this statement for some of the same reasons, it's again, all unrelated to the apparent main topic of this video. Let's go to where he gets back on track again.
But 2014's human problem has a lot to do with how Godzilla is structured and how it being in the US hinders its storytelling. American Godzilla as a whole is an oxymoron thing to begin with. A thing made to represent America's atomic bomb in Japan is now being used for American heroism.
Fucking what? The original Godzilla isn't supposed to represent just America's atomic bomb on Japan. He's supposed to represent the very idea of nuclear power as a whole, to demonstrate to everyone how deadly and fearsome it can be. Not just demonstrating to America what the bombs did to Japan. He's not being used for American heroism either. In this film, he's being used to represent an extreme force of nature itself, triumphing against creatures that wanted to fuck the world up with their spawn. Did you not pay any attention to what Dr. Serizawa said in the film?
This alpha predator of yours, Doctor. Do you really think he has a chance?
The arrogance of man is thinking nature is in our control, and not the other way around. Let them fight.
So because of this, you can't really get that much depth with Godzilla, since he's the protagonist ally to the American military.
He wasn't an ally to the American military either. The military knew that Godzilla was going to the Mutos because he wanted to kill them, which, in the best interest of the world, is what they want as well. Godzilla and the military had the same goal, the destruction of the Mutos. The reason he doesn't attack the military is because he has no reason to. They aren't pissing him off or posing as a threat.
The US doesn't have the same history of catastrophe as Japan did with the atomic bomb, and America is also obsessed with patriotism. So instead of making Godzilla an allegory for the consequences of mankind's actions, or have a much larger depth of Godzilla being a force of nature against the United States, he's now instead Superman, where he gets recontextualized to be Superman.
No, Godzilla is not Superman. Godzilla is still an allegory and force of nature, as it was only this force of nature that defeated the enemy and saved the world while the military was trying to deal with their own incompetence, because they fumbled with their nuke earlier. He demonstrated how nature restores balance when mankind cannot.
Which is hilarious when you rewatch 2014's Godzilla with this perspective after watching Japanese Godzilla films. First off, that hydrogen bomb test that destroyed the Lucky Dragon 5, which got the 1954 movie made in the first place, well, now the history has changed, and the hydrogen bomb was used to attack Godzilla.
What do you mean the history is changed? So, this may shock you, but did you know that this movie is fiction? And that it didn't actually happen? San Francisco is still around to this day, we still have that. There is no radioactive giant monster swimming around in the ocean, and nobody's saying that the Lucky Dragon 5 incident didn't happen in this fictional universe either. If you thought that was stupid, then you need to sit down and brace yourself for what he says next. Are you ready for this? Are you ready?
And after being threatened by this walking nuke and realizing there's nothing the US could do about it, it's now going to be the savior to America against the Japanese threat,
Motherfucker! Are you dead-ass telling us that you honestly believe that Godzilla is supposed to represent America in this film? And that the enemies he's trying to defeat represent Japan? The Mutos aren't even from Japan! So if you actually, watch the movie, you would have seen that both Mutos are actually from the skeletal remains of the Titan Dagon, located in the Philippines! Only one of the Mutos cocoon in Japan after hatching and leaving, but the other hatches in America! So if Godzilla is America fighting America? This point makes zero sense. I can't believe a real human being just said that in a sentence. He isn't even reaching anymore. He's past that. He is standing on furniture, desperately stretching out for anything at this point.
And then he decides he's got one more in him, so he gets up and everyone claps for him as fighter jets fly by, saving the day as he goes back into the water. Take in mind, like, thousands of people have probably died to Godzilla, and by the looks of it, evacuation seems to be terrible.
Okay, so every casualty that resulted because of Godzilla in this film was unintentional. He did not go out of his way to kill people, and at the end of the film, he literally saves the world. Of course people are going to be happy that they are safe from giant parasite monsters taking over the planet, despite the fact there was a considerable amount of casualties along the way.
It's funny when watching it because at first Godzilla isn't even the main focus of this Godzilla movie. It's this Japanese threat.
Again with the baseless Japanese threat bullshit label for the Budos fucking... Also, Godzilla is the focus. He's portrayed as a kind of benevolent force of nature, who only comes out of the depths of the ocean where he resides in order to keep the planet safe against major threats like the Mutos. Godzilla's history in this film and what his role is in this universe is a major player in this story. He's certainly a part of the main focus of the film.
That Walter White was warning everyone about, and then Godzilla only comes on screen to handle business.
He also comes on screen to handle business because, as I just said, that's the role this Godzilla plays in this universe. He's not going to hang around, he's only going to appear to stop the monster threat, and then return back to where he came from.
And when he's attacked by the US military, at first he doesn't even retaliate or go beast mode. This dude is only hyper-focused on destroying this Japanese threat.
Shut up! Shut up!
He doesn't attack the military because they barely pose a threat to him. They just want him to get away from the bridge due to the civilians being put in danger by him being there. He gets irritated by the military firing at him, so he eventually barges through their defenses. The military never posed a serious threat. The Mutos, however, posed a threat to the entire world, so of course he's going to be hyper-focused on stopping them.
And shares the sparkle with the main character, where they save each other.
Oh, for God's sake, he just happened to be there at the same time as Ford and caught a glance of him for a second. There was no bond between them. I don't even think Godzilla knew he saved Ford. He just saw a good opportunity to kill the last Muto and took it.
It's quite beautiful, actually, how much Godzilla cares about the whole world. No, he just cares about the US, because when he goes to China, even that shit gets absolutely decimated in his ego fight with the gorilla.
So I guess you didn't actually watch that movie either, because if you did, you would have seen that Godzilla actually went there because he was being provoked by this enemy signal. Hell, he attacks Florida at the beginning of the movie for the exact same reason. Once he feels he has destroyed this enemy signal, he actually goes to leave the city, feeling his work is done, the threat being stopped. You're acting like he maliciously went out of his way to destroy China, which just isn't the case. It wasn't an ego fight either. Kong thought Godzilla was a threat and challenged Godzilla into battle. Kong never acknowledged Godzilla as king either, therefore making him a challenger.
Making Godzilla Superman is strange, and later in the Monsterverse they try to add depth to this. Like, look, he actually killed a bus full of children, and this company called Monarch is really shady with documentation and control, and the whole world is still full of PTSD, which is cool at first, but then you remember this is the same guy in the same world where he teamed up with a monkey to fight a robot version of him that was made by a three-headed dragon that got defeated because water was spilt on the computer, and then Godzilla and the monkey are teaming up to fight more monkeys, and now there's a baby monkey, and now he's pinking in Fortnite. Yeah, it's over.
No, it's not. This show takes place before any of the events you just mentioned actually happen. These films show that people clearly have some level of PTSD and fear of these giants existing. So in response to learning of their existence, they protest for truth, make super weapons to try to stop them, make things to try to help them understand the monsters, and so on. Also, are you aware Godzilla 2014 did not invent the idea that Godzilla can be a hero? The original Godzilla studio themselves invented that concept. And Ishiro Honda, the director of the original Godzilla film, even directed some of the films with this concept, a concept which became a staple of the franchise. You can't blame the team behind Godzilla 2014 for looking at the Godzilla franchise and all of its concepts for ideas of what to base their film around, and deciding to go with one of the major concepts of the franchise for a premise of their own Godzilla film. Also, are new things not allowed to happen in this franchise? I recall you saying that this franchise lacks creativity, yet when it tries new concepts, you complain. Not every Godzilla movie can be solely about the horrors of war and nuclear power, because despite how powerful that message can be, if every Godzilla movie was about that, the franchise would eventually burn out. Nobody wants to see the same thing time and time again, just dressed up differently. One of the reasons Godzilla Minus One works so well is because it focused on a concept that the Godzilla franchise had not portrayed for a while in this fashion. The idea of Godzilla being a nuclear horror attacking a country that had recently experienced devastating nuclear attacks and was recovering from a war. However, if we were to get films like this time and time again, no matter what differences they would have from each other, they would eventually lose what made them special to begin with. We could only have so many Godzilla Minus Ones before they start getting ignored by audiences because of, oh, it's just another nuclear power is scary movie. The fact that we don't get films like this every time is, in part, what made Godzilla Minus One special. We don't get something like it every time, but if we did, it would eventually get boring. Godzilla has avoided something like this by bringing something new to the table with almost every outing the franchise has.
American Godzilla doesn't really stand for anything.
Fuck off. I've already pointed this out a bunch of times already, but again, he stands for the power of nature and how mankind can never control, tame, predict, or outdo it.
Even in the 2014 film, the human characters are just a guy we follow around and his family.
Ford and his family were directly involved with one of the Muto's initial attacks. Ford also was involved with multiple military operations within the film that dealt with the nuke and the Mutos. His wife was present to aid the injured because she worked as a nurse, and this gets her caught up in the peril towards the end and separated from her son, building some stakes. These main characters all contribute to the story in one way or another. We don't just follow them around aimlessly.
The United States military is skeptical at first of Godzilla's involvement, but then they just accept that he is the only hero capable of stopping the Mutos, and all is fine.
Of course they're skeptical at first. It's a fucking giant monster that's apparently going to save the world from other giant monsters and go back to minding its damn business. They don't just accept Godzilla as the only hero capable of stopping the Mutos randomly either. They come to this conclusion because their plan to stop the Mutos got fucked up, and Godzilla was the only hope left for the world.
There's no discussion or nuance about anything in the world.
Are you one of those snobby types of people who only likes movies if they try to reach you on an emotional or deep level or something? I hate this kind of perspective so much. It's like, how dare this movie not try to make me feel change within myself? It must be insulting my intelligence or something. I don't mind movies that try to do this, but like, it's also okay to enjoy movies that exist just to be fun. For example, the 1989 Batman film was loved by many, and it's still loved to this day. It doesn't try to move its audience on an emotional level, it's just a fun film that's only real message is Batman is fucking awesome. He's a guy who went through hard times in the past, and as a result, he decided to try to make a difference by fighting back against crime and protecting the innocent. And that's fine! The film adapts most of its characters from the source material well enough, it offers some great spectacle, good acting, is well written, and overall, it's a good time. The 2014 Godzilla film is kind of similar to this movie in nature. At most, it just wants to say, Godzilla, as you've come to expect, is a force of nature that can show us how powerless we can be against nature and the unknowns of our world. Now watch him kick some ass.
The Mutos that were awakened are instantly vilified without any nuance either. These things were forced to wake up, and all they wanted to do was produce and have kids.
Nobody forced them to wake up. They were drawn out unintentionally at times, but never forced. They were vilified because giant parasite monsters that kill people wanting to give birth to more giant parasite monsters that will eventually run amok around the planet and kill countless amounts of people is a bad thing. From the Muto's perspective, they just want to reproduce. But from our perspective, it would be the monster apocalypse. So yes, they are vilified because giant parasite monster apocalypse killing millions, if not billions of people is in fact not really a good thing.
But their children were blown up by Quicksilver.
Good! Who knows how many lives that act saved? It's bad from the Muto's perspective, but from ours, the monster apocalypse was just prevented.
Then the parents were murdered by Godzilla and everyone still claps in the end, even though everything's still in shambles and a shitload of people died.
The Mutos being killed by Godzilla ensures that the planet will most certainly not have hundreds of Mutos running around messing it up. People clap because the threat to their lives is gone, and most of them don't even know they were trying to have children that would spread across the world yet. Yes, San Francisco may be in shambles now, and yes, a lot of people died, but considering that the death and destruction was stopped, and it didn't spread across the entire Earth, I'd say that's something to be happy about.
This is drastically different from the 1954 version, where Godzilla is treated as a victim, even after he terrorizes and kills a bunch of innocent Japanese people.
No shit, these films are different. They're two different types of films. One basing itself on the horrors of war, and the other is basing itself on the Godzilla franchise as a whole, taking concepts from it that the studio behind Godzilla themselves created. This would be like comparing Ang Lee's 2003 Hulk film to the Incredible Hulk film to see which one has more of a psychological drama angle. Of course the Ang Lee Hulk film is going to win in that comparison, because that's the kind of film it is, while the Incredible Hulk is more action-based. They're different kinds of films.
And instead of clapping when the threat is gone, the audience is instead reminded that Godzilla never needed to happen in the first place, and that because of bomb testing, he's now also robbed of life.
Again, these are two different kinds of movies with two very different kinds of Godzillas. The original Godzilla was a violent antagonist, while this Godzilla is a rather neutral force of nature. It'd be weird if the audience got upset over this one dying.
American Godzilla being a Superman figure is really safe and boring and makes no sense due to the origins of the character.
Hey, speak for yourself, but I don't find the idea of giant monster fights boring at all. Also, these two Godzillas have different origins, and these origins explain why one would be angry and violent, and why another would be more neutral. Also, some incarnations of Godzilla depict him coming to terms with what he is, and that he doesn't have to be a force of destruction out of anger, but can rather be a force that fights to defend the world he's now a part of.
2014 Godzilla isn't flawed because it has human characters and barely shows Godzilla with only a little bit of action fights. Because as we see later, those movies are even worse. 2014 is flawed because it doesn't stand for anything, and is a safe depiction that makes this Americanized monster a hero without anything to say.
Godzilla 2014 basically says, Godzilla is a force of nature, not to be underestimated or messed with, just like nature itself. I already went into detail earlier why this is fine. Again, this film didn't make Godzilla a hero. He had been a hero for decades by this point. The film is simply following this popular concept from the franchise.
And I know 1954 is old, and that movie is aged, but recently a movie has come out that has blown all the Godzilla movies in the past 10 years out the water, and it was from Toho Studios, where Godzilla is back in Japan, and that movie was Takashi Yamazaki's Godzilla -1.
So Skipper here spends the next half a minute talking about how he thinks Godzilla -1 is great for reasons I think we can all agree with, I'm sure. Its story, characters, message, the fact it was done on such a small budget, and that it accomplishes what other modern blockbusters cannot. That's all well and good. Then he says this.
Godzilla -1 makes American Godzilla look like an embarrassment because it does everything better.
I cannot believe you have spent this much time looking at these two films and still haven't realized they're not the same kind of film, therefore making your comparison rather unfair. If Godzilla 2014 was a movie that attempted to be a story about the horrors of war and nuclear power and so on, but failed miserably, you'd have an argument here as to how Godzilla -1 did it better. But it's not. It's a film about ancient forces of nature rising to achieve their own goals that catch us unsuspecting humans in the crossfire, showing us how small we really are in the face of the unknowns of our world. Do you realize that I could make the same point from the other perspective, and say that Godzilla 2014 embarrasses Godzilla -1 because Godzilla -1 fails to be a story about the unknown forces of nature fighting each other? Of course, that would be unfair, because again, they're two different kinds of films. But that's my point.
Like 1954, Godzilla isn't a character, but more of a natural disaster. And for a natural disaster to have impact, first you need compelling people to be impacted. I cared about the human characters in this film, and I hated Godzilla for what he did to them. But the reason why the human characters were so impactful was because of Japan and how it's depicted.
Yes, that's all fair, but what you have to understand is that this film wanted to make itself about something like that. While many other Godzilla films, along with Godzilla 2014, have been about various things depicting Godzilla in various ways. But this again gets into what I talked about earlier, where a franchise needs to be different in order to maintain power. If we get films like Godzilla Minus One again and again and again, I think it's safe to assume we would eventually get burned out by them. That's why having something like Godzilla Minus One come about only once in a while makes it truly special. So he then goes into some of the rough history of Japan that involves the war and how the original Godzilla concept fits with Japan due to this and his original nature. And that's fair. But then he goes into this.
Which brings up a huge point for why this movie exists. It's once again an anti-war film where you're reminded that the Imperial Japan military was not great and that the modern Japanese government is not that great either. Japanese studios such as Ghibli and even films like 1954's Godzilla tend to only depict Japan as the victims to catastrophe from the United States.
Maybe this is just me, but I myself never got the idea that Japan was being depicted as a victim of the United States when watching Godzilla 1954. I found it to be getting a message across of the horrors nuclear power can have on any population anywhere, making it have more of a universal message. The fact it was made in, as well as takes place in Japan, a country that experienced nuclear bombs being detonated on 2 of its major cities, makes it all the more credible. This country and its people experienced devastating nuclear attacks firsthand. The film allows them to demonstrate how horrifying it was, and that it can happen to any country, not just ones that get into conflict with America in a war. Next, he discusses the ferocity of the Japanese military soldiers during the Second World War, and how these soldiers were brutal with no regard of whether they live or die, which leads him to say this.
But with everything aside, without the atomic bomb drop, Japan would have continued a relentless war with the United States.
Yeah, just a little detail you forgot to mention in there. Yes, the Japanese would have continued fighting the United States had it not been for the bombs. But eventually, due to the lack of resources and soldiers, the Japanese army theoretically would have had to surrender to the Allied powers at some point. Except, had we gone this way, it is estimated that many more people on both sides of the war would have been killed as a result. This is part of one of the major controversies of using the atomic bombs. It's just odd to me that this outcome controversy isn't brought up here whatsoever, and he just says that Japan would have continued fighting.
So while I know Godzilla 1954 is very much still an anti-war film about how nukes are bad, showing what Japan went through, it does brush past that Japan's military threw a stone at the United States, killing United States civilians when they were well aware they were never going to win a conflict with the United States, but still did it anyway since they needed to get resources from claimed US lands that were under embargo laws. So Pearl Harbor was an attack on the US Navy to demoralize the US, but they didn't attack the repair yards, so it was pointless anyway, and got their whole nation nuked in retaliation.
What?
Why would Godzilla 1954 have to talk about that? It's a story of nuclear horror and the effects it can have on populations and its people. Why would you mention Japan provoking a country into joining a war that eventually led to Japan being nuked in order to make an effort to end said war? It's not about that. It's about what these kinds of weapons can do, the effects they have, and what about them makes them so terrifying. Again, it's a universal message of the horrors of mass destruction because of nuclear weapons. After this, he talks about how Japan's culture was changing, taking on more of a Western influence, and that the military took control of the government from the inside. And he brings this up to say,
I joked about it earlier, but people like Ishiro Honda, who made the original Godzilla, was even at fault for this. While he acknowledged how horrific war was, he still made propaganda films for the Japanese military, which led to this cancer spreading.
What Japanese government propaganda? This film is discussing that nuclear power is devastating and terrifying. I think we can all agree on that. I don't see how that's some secretive propaganda. Nobody watched this film back in the day and thought they had to go into the military and sacrifice themselves.
Propaganda and military control started dragging Japanese society into their conflicts. Men were expected to go to war and die. It was seen as honorable to serve and die for your military. This is why I prefer Minus One to the original 1954 movie, because Minus One is critical to the Japanese government.
Afterwards, he talks about how Godzilla Minus One is critical of the old Japanese government that had no regard for the lives of its soldiers, which, yes, is indeed true. It's just that comparing it to the 1954 Godzilla film in this manner makes no sense, because the 1954 Godzilla film isn't about, in part, how the Japanese government treated its military. It's about the horrifying effects that nuclear power can have on an unsuspecting population of citizens. Afterwards, Skipper brings up how the original Godzilla film was re-edited into Godzilla King of the Monsters, a version of the film that cuts out a lot of the critical commentary on nuclear power as to not make America look bad for its nuclear weapons use, and adds a lot of scenes featuring Raymond Burr so that American audiences would be more drawn to the film with it now having a familiar face. But this happened a long time ago, and shouldn't be used to make an argument of Godzilla not being able to work in America. Since then, Godzilla became an actual franchise. New ideas and concepts were introduced into it. The original version of the film became widely available eventually for everyone to see, and other Godzilla films have been released since then that have heavy messaging to them as well. The franchise and the world has changed, and naturally, the films are going to reflect this, even if it's as little as a film being based around a staple concept of the franchise it's taking part in.
So when we look at the depth of something like -1 and then go back to 2014, you see more cracks of how 2014 has nothing to say.
I really don't mean to keep repeating myself. I know I've done it a lot here already. But again, this comparison is unfair. Godzilla -1 is a film that wanted to have something powerful to say. Godzilla 2014 wanted to simply say nature is unpredictable, but also mainly serve as a fun blockbuster for fans. And that's fine. They're different kinds of films.
My friend Sweets Online gave me a quote when we were talking about this video. If you want to know what the biggest piggy bank is in the world, look at the United States military. Funding games like Call of Duty, movies like Top Gun, and many other pieces of media to display the United States military. You could get a lot of your budget paid when you display the military as heroic badasses.
So he spends the next minute talking about how the US military will fund films and projects that depict them positively, and will not fund films and projects that depict them in a more negative light. Wow! It's almost like if your film is going to talk about something negatively, that something isn't going to fund your film that will talk about it negatively. What a revelation! So why did he bring all of that up?
So when you see Godzilla 2014 with a budget of $160 million, with American Navy and bomb squads and Air Force all helping Godzilla save the day, it's no surprise that the film had an agreement with the Department of Defense where they provided locations, vehicles, and military representation.
So I really fail to see why that's an issue. Just because they helped Godzilla doesn't mean Godzilla has been bastardized in some way. Of course they are going to be portrayed positively in this kind of story. Their goal is trying to save the world from the Mutos, a goal which they happen to share with Godzilla.
And while at times the military is incompetent and kind of useless in the film, it's never acknowledged or critiqued with grand messaging. Because like I said, to bite the hand that feeds you is going to drop your budget from $160 million to a low $15 million like Godzilla -1. It's why Godzilla can't work in America.
First off, what kind of grand messaging do you think could come from the mistakes the military makes in Godzilla 2014? It's not any ethical problems to be questioned, it's more of the fact that the Mutos take their nuke and thusly put tons of lives in danger. Aren't those consequences enough to signify that mistakes were made? Also, the point here about the budget being dropped for a film based on how the military is portrayed has nothing to do with how Godzilla works as a whole. Godzilla can work in a story where the military is criticized and he's a nuclear horror, and he can also work in a film where he's more of a hero character, and the military fights with him because they each have the same goal of saving their world from some threat. What you're saying without realizing it is that Godzilla stories that portray the military negatively can't work in America due to the need for the budget from the military that would theoretically be denied by them due to the negative portrayal. This doesn't mean other kinds of Godzilla stories wouldn't work in America.
To be critical of the United States government requires you to be independent. And by how bloated the film industry is with high film budgets and how propaganda has affected how the Godzilla character is viewed, you make more money by having Godzilla be Superman.
Again, Godzilla can be a hero. If budget restrictions only allow him to be a hero character who fights alongside the military, this doesn't mean the character isn't working. Godzilla has been a defender of Earth for decades now. This goes back into what I was saying earlier, where what you don't realize is that you're saying Godzilla's stories that are critical of the military don't work, and not the entirety of the character himself.
Killing tons of innocent people where then they clap at him saving the day, rather than him destroying the United States with the government losing and being useless.
He never kills innocent people intentionally. He's always provoked by some other far more dangerous threat to the planet, where he either goes to try to defeat this threat, or thinks he's defeating the threat and therefore protecting the planet by lashing out. Godzilla destroying the United States and rendering the government useless is just a choice of story. And just because a Godzilla film doesn't follow this kind of story, doesn't mean that Godzilla as a whole isn't working, as there are other stories he can follow laid out by the franchise previously.
And this has been a problem since 1956, when America turned a tragedy film to a blockbuster, gutting it of any meaning, and no surprise Godzilla King of the Monsters made way more money than Gojira.
Of course it made more money. I don't know if you noticed, but America is a much larger country than Japan, and it has a greater number of citizens. We had a far better economy than Japan did back then as well. The original version wasn't available in America, and I'm sure if it was, it would have made more money than it did having just been released only in Japan. I'm not saying it would have made more money than Godzilla King of the Monsters. because Godzilla King of the Monsters had a familiar face in it, among other things, but exposing a product to a much larger market is bound to get it more money.
Godzilla King of the Monsters made way more money than Gojira, so much so that Japan stopped calling him Gojira and took on Godzilla.
What the hell are you talking about? The name Godzilla is a rough translation of the Japanese Gojira name. They're using the same name, it's just been translated. Also, they didn't start calling him just Godzilla either. Have you heard how they pronounce his name in Japan?
Godzilla.
That's right, it's still Gojira. They never stopped calling him that.
And repainted his image as the savior of Japan that fought giant monsters.
Godzilla King of the Monsters may have been altered from the original quite a bit, but for God's sake, Godzilla was still the violent antagonist of that film. Why would this film spawn the desire within Toho to make Godzilla a hero when it made money depicting him as the exact opposite? Also, several of the films following the initial film still depicted him as a violent destroyer, and while this changed down the line in the original era of Godzilla films, other later Godzilla film eras would go back to depicting him as a terrifying destroyer again. The Godzilla film eras that you failed to mention in this video.
529 million, 387 million. They're making money, and that's all that matters now. But what is art, and how do we view art?
Oh my fucking... Never once have I ever heard anyone ask this question without following it up with some of the most senseless bullshit you've ever heard in your life.
Is a nothing blockbuster funded by the US military better than a $15 million Japanese film with a lot to say because it made more money?
I don't know! That's up to the viewer! We've already talked about why Godzilla 2014 isn't a nothing blockbuster. And maybe the viewer is the kind of Godzilla fan that prefers a film where Godzilla is more heroic and gets into battles over a film more serious in tone. And that's perfectly fine.
Is King of the Monsters better than Gojira since it made more money?
Again, it's up to the viewer. I myself prefer Gojira, but I could understand how some may, and do, enjoy the more lighthearted cheesy spirit of Godzilla King of the Monsters.
We're beginning to look at box office as this risk-reward system, where studios don't see the risk of making something if it can't possibly 10 times its original budget.
So studios do actually have to consider things like this when making film. Studios are made up of people's jobs, and if films are made that constantly flop, there will eventually be no profit, people won't get paid, and then everything just falls apart. We can't forget that workers need to be compensated and overall treated properly, even if it means that movies that may be good don't get made at that moment because there is no shot that they'll make money. It's just how it works. However, I'm not saying that studios should stop trying and should lower themselves to this.
Surprised to see me?
I became the ultimate weapon. There is only Monarch!
I'm sure there are plenty of good stories out there for films to tell that will make them some profit.
And this rubs off how we view movies. If something makes a lot of money, it must be good. And if a movie flops, it must be bad. It's the same as judging a book by its cover. Yes, there's movies that spend way too much money not being creative because they believe they could 10 times their budget by simply existing. But then we get films like Gojira and Godzilla Minus One, which are real creative works of art that stand for something and matter aside from just money, and they need to be praised.
And they do get praised for that. Tons of movies like the ones you just mentioned, where they don't try anything new and think they can make money by simply existing, have been bombing left and right as of recently, while Godzilla Minus One is making a ton of money. And while part of the reason it's making a lot of money is due to the fact that it's an amazing film, it's also because it's a Godzilla movie. And the Godzilla franchise is pretty huge and has tons of fans. The difference here is that for the most part, the Godzilla franchise continues to be consistently fresh with ideas and doesn't outright disrespect its source material, while a lot of other franchises have been, like the Marvel Cinematic failed Biopsy, where they stopped caring about the source material because they thought they could be lazy and still make big money, which as we've seen, has backfired on them and others like them.
But like how everything works, Godzilla isn't liked because of what it stands for, because what America saw was a cool giant monster that attacked Japan, not an allegory for nuclear war. And what they see now is a Superman figure that could sell toys. Godzilla has become a mascot to make money. It's why I can't enjoy the Looney Tunes version. It's why Godzilla can't work in America.
For the final time, Godzilla has been a hero figure for decades now. America wasn't the first to do this. Godzilla doesn't have to be a negative allegory for war in every piece of media he's in. It's how the franchise has survived this long. It continues to be new and refreshing, and on the occasion that it does go back to an older theme, if done well, it's praised. Because most Godzilla fans don't mind seeing something old that they like every once in a while presented in a new way, which is why Godzilla Minus One worked.
But if there's anything I can hope to get across with this video, it's to research the things you watch.
What did you just fucking say to me?
It's to research the things you watch. It's to research the things you watch.
I can't make this shit up.
And to give things with passion a try, even if you might not enjoy it. Some filmmakers actually give a shit about what they make, and use art to have a voice and tell stories without the dooming cloud of getting money from your pocket.
Are you aware that Gareth Edwards, the director of the 2014 Godzilla film, likes Godzilla? He brought passion to that film, and just because it isn't the kind of story you prefer for this character, doesn't mean the film has no soul at all.
Minus One is a must-watch, but I fear, like 1954, it won't be acknowledged or talked about in the masses, especially in America due to its subject matter and being a foreign film.
Fucker, everybody has been talking about Minus One. And tons of people have gone back to acknowledge and talk about the original film ever since its availability was made widespread as well. Do you live under a rock?
2014 Godzilla, you still look good and are shot very well and have the best roar, but you're nothing but a soulless, nothing piece of propaganda that breaks my heart.
Shut the fuck up. Welp, it's over. And it goes without saying, wow, what a shit video. Doktor Skipper made a near half-an-hour video that he didn't even bother to do basic research for. He made it in order to get some bullshit point across that makes absolutely zero logical sense. A large chunk of his video was just spent analyzing two different kinds of Godzilla films and being surprised when these two different kinds of Godzilla films were different from each other, and used that, along with some of the most clown-brained interpretations of film I've ever heard in my life,
It's now going to be the savior to America against the Japanese threat
as a basis of some absurd argument as to why a whole franchise can't work in America when it absolutely does. Had Skipper done the basic research necessary when attempting to do a video like this properly, he would have realized this for himself. It honestly feels like his whole video script was AI generated, which may actually be likely, as it was brought to my attention that Skipper has been sponsored by some AI services before.
I assume you've heard about AI art somewhere, right? Well, today's video is sponsored by Wonder. Wonder is an app that turns words that are coming out of my very mouth now into digital art made entirely by AI.
It is worth noting that due to the backlash he got for this video, Doktor Skipper posted an apology of sorts on Twex. Here he admits to having made mistakes, but he essentially says he didn't bother to do research on Godzilla to begin with because he doesn't care about the franchise. It just begs the question of why he'd make a video on something he knows apparently very little about. I get a lot of people have already shit all over this video, but for me, it was important to go in depth and explain as to why this video is just such nonsense, and to counter a lot of the disinformation, and to set the record straight. Basically, what I'm trying to say is, video bad. And this was why. Use Why Godzilla Doesn't Work in America as a prime example of what not to do when making a video on a franchise. This was a long one, and I thank you for sticking around.
It's to research the things you watch.